So good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you're keeping safe and well. My name's Steve Edmonds, and I'd like you to thank you for joining me at this week's NGA webinar, which is on the role of governing boards in the safe reopening of schools from the 1st of June. And when I say the safe reopening of schools, I should we should all acknowledge and indeed celebrate the fact that schools have remained open throughout the COVID-19 crisis and playing a crucial part in a national effort to fight this dreadful disease. They've been providing essential provision for our most vulnerable pupils and indeed the children of key workers as well. So that needs to be acknowledged. So what I'm talking about today is the government's announcement that from the 1st of June, they would like to see primary schools welcome back their nursery, reception, year 1 and year 6 pupils, and secondary schools, they would like to see them offering face-to-face support to year 10 and year 12 students who are due to take important exams next year. And for nurseries and early year settings, those providers have been asked to welcome back all their children on the 1st of June, or sorry, from the 1st of June. That's a very important distinction. So that's what we've been asked to positively plan for, but the final decision will only be made after ministers have reviewed the latest scientific advice in a week's time on the 28th of May. And as I'm sure you all know, the government's position that it's best that we move forward with this intention as a whole country, but it's become increasingly clear that schools are going to have to take into account their own local conditions and decide what they are safely able to do in this circumstance. Now, this is now a national conversation, and it has given rise to some very deep and profound concerns that have been expressed by professional associations on behalf of their members, by parents on behalf of their children, of course, and by local authorities, many of which have said they don't believe it's safe for the schools in their area to reopen to more pupils on the 1st of June. And I'm sure that these concerns and issues have featured in your own conversations at school and board level about what you're safely able to do. Now, I'm afraid that I can't guarantee that I'll be able to address those concerns that you have directly through this webinar. What I want to do is to give some clarity regarding the really important role that we have as governors and trustees in scrutinising the assessment of risk that's made by our school leaders that informs those decisions about how and when we open safely for more pupils. It's something that I'm acutely aware of myself. I think I've mentioned in previous webinars that I chair a governing board myself, so I feel that weight of responsibility to support getting children back as soon as possible, but not at any price, and certainly not at the price of anyone's safety. And that's a very important message. Now, for the purpose of this webinar, notwithstanding technical issues which we've had up till now, I'm prioritising content over presentation. So if you see me looking down or picking up my notes, then it's because I'm trying not to overlook some important messages and information that I want to share with you in the time that we have available. This is an interactive webinar, and I'm going to be asking you some questions and inviting you to do the same by submitting questions through the questions function that's available on this webinar software. And what I'll do is my very best to address those questions before we finish in the time that we have available. But regardless, I will ensure that in some way NGA responds to the questions and comments that you want to leave. I should also say that we've produced an information briefing that's been published this afternoon to coincide with this webinar on this very subject, and that will be shared with you, the audience, after we finish today, and it's available for all on our website as well. And you will know that I'm just going to move to my next slide. And you will know that the Department for Education has also issued guidance on how it believes schools can safely reopen for more pupils, and that's general guidance for schools and education settings. That's guidance, specific guidance on implementing the protective measures that are necessary in order to have more pupils back in school safely, and then guidance that addresses or attempts to address specific concerns that parents and carers may have. Now, I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to engage with that guidance, to read it yourself, or certainly try and familiarise yourself with the key messages, because you may feel that you already know what's in it based on the reporting of the guidance or second-hand accounts, and you probably do, but it's worth getting your own perspective and your own clarity of thought on what's in the guidance, because that's going to help you very much in those governing board conversations that you have with your school leaders about the assessment of risk. And I'll be touching on aspects of the guidance during this webinar. And what I'll also be doing is proceeding really in the spirit of positive implementation. So I want to focus on three things primarily. That's the role that we have in scrutinising the risk assessments that are brought to us by our school leaders, on which the decisions will be based and informed by. I want to reconcile that role with the role that we have, those of us who govern, as employers of the staff at our school, or the role that we have as in place of employers, those employment responsibilities that we have had conferred upon us, and to reconcile those responsibilities with this process, because I know that's something that's very much exercised you and has caused some concern. So I want to look at that a bit more closely. But more importantly, or most importantly, I want to outline the approach that we can take to testing the robustness of the risk assessments that are brought to us and shared with us by our school leaders. And I'm going to do that through three phases of scrutiny, which I will talk about in more detail later. So, as I said, this webinar will proceed in the spirit of positive implementation, because it goes without saying, I hope, that there isn't a governing board in the country, certainly not mine, that does not want to see their school full of children again. But as I've also said, that is not at any price, and it certainly is not at the price of the safety of others. So we need to understand what we can safely achieve and how we can safely reopen for our pupils and ensure the safety of others. Now, we're acutely aware at NGA that there are huge frustrations, and indeed there is a great deal of confusion about what the official guidance has said, what it doesn't say, and how it's been communicated. We hear and understand those frustrations and concerns, and all I can say really about that is that we are continuing to convey our concerns on your behalf and seek clarity on your behalf through those policy making forums that we are privileged to be part of. Now, the webinar will outline a broad approach, because that's really all I can do. I have to accept that your own school's needs and circumstances are unique, and how you approach this and what is being asked of you will be, is very different depending on what type of school you are, what part of the country you're in, what your school community looks like, and indeed your own governing structure. So if I'm not as specific about something as you would like me to be, then don't forget that our Gold Line advice service is open to all governing boards at this time, and you can run any particular queries and issues by them as well. And in fact, I'd encourage you to do that. But if there's one message, overarching key message that I'd like to leave with you above anything today, is that when we're talking about the government guidance on how the safe return of more pupils can be achieved, we have to remember that it is just that. It's guidance. You have the discretion to take your own approach to this and decide what you can safely achieve in your own context. So I know that the guidance has exercised so many, and understandably so, but it's really important to know that we and remember that we do what we think is best for our children and our staff and our school communities. And if that doesn't reconcile with the guidance, or it means we're unable to follow the guidance, or indeed not open at all, then that is how it will be. So having got those things out of the way, I'd really like to get down to the nitty-gritty, if I may, and find out where you are, your governing boards are in your own thinking and planning for this eventuality. So I've compiled two polls that I want to conduct concurrently with you, and the results I think will be of interest to us all. And the first question I'd like to ask you, and the first poll I'd like to conduct, is following the announcement that was made about the reopening to more pupils and the publication of the guidance. Has your governing board entered into a dialogue with your school leader about the school's plan and risk assessment for achieving it? And as I run you through the options, I'm going to ask my colleague Molly, who's supporting me on today's webinar, to open up that first poll. Hopefully Molly can hear me, and yeah, she's opening the poll now. That's a great reassurance to me to know that she's hearing and listening to me. So we have four options for you to select here. First, yes, simply the dialogue has commenced, it's begun, it's ongoing. Second option is no, the dialogue has not commenced, but it will be, it's about to commence. Third option is you're not quite sure when the dialogue will be commencing, but you're confident about finding out and asking the relevant people about the board's engagement in this process. And the fourth option, the one that I'm hoping least of you will select, is that you feel in the dark about what your school is planning and how it's assessing risk and how it will be engaging your governing board in that process. So those are the four clear options, and the poll is open now, and I can't quite see that you're responding. So if I just open the poll for me, I can see that, oh, I'm very encouraged by actually what I can see in front of me, that 84% of you, the overwhelming majority, have already commenced a dialogue with your school leaders about your school's plan and risk assessment. And that I'm not surprised about, because we're on not only a very fluid time scale, but a very tight time scale and an evolving situation. So this is a conversation that needs to have started, and I'm glad that for the majority of you it has already. For the 4% of you that are in the dark about this and are not clear what's going to happen, I'd really, if I had the opportunity, like to unpick why that is. Maybe you want to submit a comment or a question through the questions function, or indeed contact me directly or our advice team directly, and perhaps we can guide you and give you some advice that gives you more clarity on what's happening, because I think that's very important. So what I've established there is the overwhelming majority of you are already in a dialogue, which is good to see, because it means you're well placed to answer the second question that I'm going to pose, the second poll I'm going to conduct. And I'm just going to move things on to my next slide. And the second question I want to ask you is that now you're actually in that dialogue. So what do you understand, what do you believe the situation to be at the schools where you govern, based on those discussions, what you've read and what you've learned so far? Do you think that it will be safe, or do you not think it will be safe for your school to admit any more pupils at present from the 1st of June? Do you think, as we do at the school I govern at, that we will be able to adopt the DfE guidance, but in our own context, in our own way, and plan accordingly? Or are you in the camp of not knowing or thinking it's too early to say at this stage? And that second poll is open, and that's interesting because, again, as I see those answers come in, the overwhelming majority of you are actually of the view that you will be able to reopen in some way along the lines that of the government's ambition, adapting your own plans to your own local circumstances. So that's useful. So I've got a sense now of who I'm talking to and where you are in your current thinking. So thank you very much for sharing that with me. And for the 10% of you who don't think it will be safe to admit any more pupils at present, I'm sure that is a very considered assessment based on risk as well. And as I said earlier, you do what you think is right and in the interests of your pupils. So I'm going to move on from the poll, if I may, to my next slide. And what I really want to do is talk about the process or our approach, the approach to scrutinising risk. But I don't think I can do that really without addressing head on the question of who makes the decision to open the school to more pupils from the 1st of June, how that decision is made, and to be absolutely blunt, who carries the can for it. This is because this is probably the most the common issue that has been raised with us since the government's announcement almost 2 weeks ago. Those three issues are the ones that have been raised most through our advice line and through the feedback that you've given us. So whilst I'd like to focus on the risk assessment process or the risk assessment scrutiny, I don't think I can do so really without attempting to clear this up as simply and as clearly as I can. So apologies for the slightly busy slide that you're looking at, but I wanted to get all of this information on one slide to build a narrative because there is some nuance here, and I think that's very important to consider. So let's start from the beginning, shall we? NGA, as does the Department for Education and the professional associations, views a decision about the wider reopening to be an operational one, an operational decision that's taken by school leaders because it's driven by operational issues, and it's because school leaders know their schools management and organisation better than anyone, and therefore they are best placed to make the detailed decisions required when it comes to the safety and well-being of their pupils, of their staff, and of people who come onto the school site. So that's why we view this to be an operational decision. Now, that said, and here comes the nuance, it would be seriously unwise for them to take that decision independently without first seeking the advice of their governing boards. When push comes to shove, school leaders are acutely aware that they are employees and they have the responsibilities that comes with them being employees, and their relationship with the governing board is such that it is almost certain that they will seek the advice of the governing board on this operational decision, not least because the governing board as a corporate entity remains accountable and responsible for that operational decision. Now, I'm saying this in general and broad terms. Of course, we need to take into account the governing structure of your particular institution and how that devolves and concentrates decision-making power and responsibility. But in general terms that we can all understand and relate to, the governing board, it carries responsibility for decisions taken at operational level, and we know that, or we should know that, or that should be made clear to us when we sign up to become governors or trustees. That should be explained to us. Now, that also means, and it follows, that legally, strictly speaking, the governing board could actually be the decision maker here and take the decision itself about the wider reopening, or even step in to take that decision if it had confidence issues with the operational decision that was being put forward or taken by their school leader. But the reality here, realistically, it is the case that governing boards will be focusing on quality assuring and testing the robustness of their leaders' judgment and their risk assessment. They'll be prioritising that over exercising power and control, unless they have very good reason to. So in reality, it's a collaborative process. The school leader is at the forefront of it with their operational knowledge, understanding, and responsibility, but the governing board has responsibility for the decision. Therefore, their advice will be sought. It will be a collaborative process, and that may well end up with the school leader asking the governing board to formally ratify the decision, or the governing board endorsing it in some way, so the whole school community is absolutely clear that everyone is on board and the decision has been made by the school or trust as an institution. So I hope I've cleared that up in terms of where NGA stands on who is the decision maker and how the decision making process should work in this case. And I don't in any way want to trivialize the deep concern and that's been expressed to us about the accountability and the responsibility that comes with that, with having overall responsibility, and many governors and trustees have contacted us about their personal liability, or if they are how they might be rather personally liable in this situation. And it's absolutely understandable that you'll have concerns about carrying the can for any decisions that are being made. So there are some important points to make here as well. Yes, absolutely, the governing board's employment responsibilities, whether they have been conferred on them or whether they are the direct employer, will include taking those reasonable steps to make sure that the staff and the pupils aren't exposed to risks and are kept safe. Now, that involves the assessment of risk as an ongoing activity, and it's never been more important than it is now. But what we also need to convey is that in this context is that the governing board and your school leader has not made this policy decision that schools should start to invite back more pupils from the 1st of June. You're not responsible for that. The government has made that decision. What you are doing reasonably, honestly, and in good faith is working within the parameters set by the government's guidance, having due regard for your local authority and public health advice, and carrying out those credible assessment of risks at school level. And if you do all those things and act properly, then that will serve to protect both you and your school leaders from liability. And any good lawyer will tell you that employer liability claims for compensation against individuals are extremely rare in schools. Now, that is just a matter of fact. So hopefully I've cleared that up for you without trivializing it. It's all about how you act in good faith, and really the narrative should be what we need to do to safely reopen or to guarantee safety more than what keeps us out of court. I don't think that's a helpful narrative, so I'm not going to engage in it, but at the same time, I don't want to trivialise the concern. So now I've got that out of the way, which I'm pleased to have done. I can move on to what I really want to talk about, which is our role in the risk assessment process. And we're recommending, and the government is advising that head teachers or school leaders will undertake a full risk assessment before making a decision about reopening to more pupils, and that process, as I've said, should and will involve the governing board. And as that risk assessment takes shape, as in most major decisions taken by school leaders, chairs and vice chairs tend to be used as a sounding board, prior to engagement with the full board on that. That's certainly been my experience as a chair of a governing board over the years. I don't encourage, and I'm not part of any inner cabinet, and I'm not. That's not what I'm saying. But that's a very important role that chairs and indeed vice chairs play. That extra backup for their school leaders, helping them clarify their own thoughts and positions before they're taken to the wider board. And I'm sure that's what's happening in most cases here. Now we've advised, or we continue to advise, that you plan ahead and call an extraordinary governing board meeting to examine the documented risk assessment. Well, time is not on our side here, and the majority of you are already entered into a dialogue. So those plans will be in place to engage the governing board in the examination of the risk assessment. And if you require more advice on how to convene meetings and urgent meetings in this current COVID climate, then we've produced separate guidance on that, which is freely available on our website. And that includes the process of taking urgent decisions as well. So the important point is that you have the opportunity collectively to scrutinise, ask questions, and provide insight into the risk assessment that's brought to you by your school leader. And I'm advocating 3 phases of scrutiny, which I'm about to share with you now. And if you forgive me, true to my word, I'm going to refer to my notes here so I don't miss anything important out. And I'm just going to go to my next slide as well. And the first phase of that risk assessment is what I've referred to as testing its general robustness. So that document that's presented to you should have enough detail for you to be assured that it's based on a credible framework. The Department for Education has published its own checklist for schools, as have many local authorities and trusts. And in fact, I know a great number of local authorities have also provided a declaration of conformity to go along with the risk assessment that schools are returning, so they can have their own overview of the schools that they maintain. And I'll come on to that in a moment. But there are also risk assessment documents and frameworks out there provided by professional associations to help school leaders prepare and decide their arrangements. So the first thing you'll want to do is understand what that's actually, what's the basis of your own risk assessment. Then you want to know and see that it's taken into account the relevant advice given by local health authorities and through the local authority and indeed through the trust. Now, if you govern at a local authority maintained school where the local authority is the employer, then you would need a very strong reason to go against any local authority advice on how you assess and implement risk. And even if you don't govern at a school where the local authority is the direct employer, then it would still be wise to take that advice into account in your planning and apply it to your own to your own local context. You'll want to understand, of course, the feedback that's been given by parents and staff, maybe through their professional association, about opening safely for more pupils. I know that many parents remain unconvinced. At my own school, I think the current data is suggesting around 80% of parents are saying that they're not confident of sending their pupils, their children rather, back to school. We need to dig a little bit deeper into those particular year groups and find out what we can do to reassure them further. But it's a very big challenge. So that needs to be taken into account alongside the views of staff as well in the assessment of overall risk. Of course, the risk can't be separate to the school's plan, and that plan will be to gradually and methodically increase the number of pupils in those year groups that have been welcomed back. They won't be all coming back on the 1st of June. That is not realistic. You will know that by now. But at the same time, it needs to make informed assumptions about the take-up of places. And what we're saying about that, and what most people are saying about that, is that when you're planning for the return of pupils, even if the indications are that they won't be coming back in great numbers, it's probably a good idea to assume that they will be. So that makes the risk assessment more robust, by definition, if you like. And then there are some wider considerations there of risk of not proceeding, in fact, or not proceeding at a quicker pace, and that is how well placed are you to provide remote education and continue to provide that for those pupils, because we're very concerned, aren't we, about the educational impact that lockdown has had, despite the fantastic efforts of our teachers during this very difficult time. And then there's very specific needs of vulnerable and disadvantaged pupils as well. So those are the things that every risk assessment should have regard to, and that should be your first phase really of scrutiny, making sure that those things are there and they are credible. And that lends itself then really to phase two, what I'm referring to as phase two of the risk assessment, and that's the informed discussion that takes place in the context of your school. Now, at this stage or in this phase, you'll be giving perhaps more specific or particular regard to the department's guidance on protective measures as a point of reference almost for the scrutiny of risk and what you are safely able to do. So what we're talking about here are the measures that the school can reasonably and feasibly take to minimise the contact and mixing of pupils and staff. So that's organising classes into smaller groups, 15 or maybe less than 15. Again, in the case of my primary school, it will be less than 15 because we don't have the space. Maintaining space between seats in corridors, staggering the school day to reduce movement around the school, and those protocols that parents will need to observe when they're picking up and dropping off their children. So what can you safely achieve? What are those measures that you can take that will guarantee safety at a level that you're comfortable with? Follows then the same principle with hygiene practices. So we're talking about hand washing facilities here, the availability of hand sanitizers, the hygiene protocols that you can reasonably put in place at your school, and how that then extends to contractors and suppliers as well, and visitors. Your cleaning arrangements, because obviously deep cleaning will be very much a feature of school life going forward. So what arrangements have you been able to make with contractors and suppliers? What capacity do you have to provide the level of adequate and regular cleaning that you need to minimise risk? And then the measures that the school are able to take to minimise the risk of contact with anyone with COVID-19 systems. Now that's built around the communication that you have with parents, carers, visitors and suppliers about not entering the school if they are displaying symptoms, for example, and ensuring that those messages are abundantly clear. So those are the things that you're having informed conversations about in the context of your school. And because this conversation is in, and this discussion is in the context of your school, it will take into account any additional measures that are designed to protect members of your school community that you've identified or may identify as being particularly vulnerable. So that may be older members of staff with underlying health conditions, or groups, black and minority ethnic groups who are unfortunately appear to be at greater risk to contracting this awful disease. So you move from phase one, which is the general robustness, into the informed discussion about what you can safely do, or what you can reasonably and feasibly logistically do to keep children and everyone else safe in your school. And from there, we move into phase three. Now, that's the overall assessment of risk and what you are safely able to do. So based on those first two phases, what are the risks that you really think you can mitigate for? What are the risks that you can partially mitigate for? And what are the things that actually you don't think you can do anything about, despite your best efforts, because of your logistics, your sites, your whatever the limiting factors may be. Now that will then bring you, or should bring you and your school leader, to the resulting decision about inviting pupils back on the 1st of June, and in what way you do that, whether that's prioritising in the way that the government's guidance has said, or whether that's adopting an approach that's based on the government's guidance, or it may end up in a conclusion, as it appears to for 10% of you in the poll, that actually we can't do it at this time. So we're going to keep reviewing it, and as the situation evolves, and as the advice changes or the situation changes, rate of infection, those kind of things, we will assess our risk level of risk accordingly. So those are three phases that I think are really important for any governing board to undergo with their school leader, and provides a framework, if you like, for an informed conversation. And if you get that right, and if you feel confident and clear at the end of that about what you're going to do, then it puts you in a position where you can confidently, alongside your school leader, communicate your school's approach, which is very important, because that then will build confidence in the school community. Now, what I'm not going to do actually is go through all of these slides, all of the details on the next two slides, because I'm acutely aware of the time. We've had some technical issues, and also these slides feel a little operational, but I needed to include them, and you'll want to reflect on them perhaps after the webinar, the sort of issues or the sort of points that will need to be made in those confident communications about that really have the safety and welfare of children and staff at their heart. So you're providing that clarity and that confidence to the people that you're encouraging back into school, in an attempt to restart things gradually back to where they were prior to lockdown. Second slide here again contains a little bit more operational detail, and they're all things that I've covered in the three phases of risk assessment. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that, if I may, because I think I'd like to sort of summarize what I've said up till now by just making a few closing comments. And the first of those is that the government are aiming the schools to begin opening further from the 1st of June and not on the 1st of June. So this is an evolving process. You might not be able to do all that's envisaged to begin with, because you've assessed the risk of that, and it's just not possible. So you will proceed with extreme caution and care, and take a gradual approach if you believe that's the right thing to do. And as I've already said, that will vary dependent on your phase, and you should not feel pressurised in any way, shape or form to implementing the guidance if you don't feel you can do that, and you have the discretion to make your own judgments and approach risk in a way that you think is appropriate in your context. But it doesn't stop, does it, on the 1st of June or even following the 1st of June. We will gradually and increasingly, as we become more informed and see how things progress nationally and in our own context, reassess the risks and hopefully find ourselves in a position where we can welcome more and more pupils back to a point where our schools are what they're meant to be, full of children, the brilliant, vibrant places that we all want them to be or remember them as, and it's why we govern, isn't it? When it comes down to it, we do it for those children, and we want them to be back, and we want the school to be the best that it can be for them, but only at the right time. So those are really important points to remember. So having covered risk and decision making and had a few technical difficulties on the way, I'm now going to throw myself into some of your questions and statements, and hopefully I'll be able to pick some of those up as I grapple with the technology. Right, I'm just moving up. I'm right, so I'm doing my best to answer these questions, grappling with the technology, and I'll read one or two out to you. What is our responsibility to key workers and vulnerable children in reception year 1 and 6 who have been attending school throughout once school reopens? Good question. I hope I made that clear. If I didn't, apologies. It is the case that the government is asking schools to reopen to more pupils, but it's ask and that the children of key workers and vulnerable children are in school remain. So it's still the case that schools, those priority groups, remain priority groups and should be encouraged to attend school. So hopefully I've cleared that one up there. I'm just going to move to another one. As a safeguarding governor, are there any additional checks that I need to focus on regarding the government's proposals? Another good and important question. We issued some specific guidance on the board's safeguarding responsibilities during this time a few weeks ago, and that guidance remains pretty much unchanged. When it comes to the considerations for the safeguarding governor, I wouldn't say that they were any greater or any different to what they normally are. It may well be that in that very important role that you play a leading part in a discussion about risk, and you ask particular and pertinent questions that your informed knowledge in that role allows you to ask. But I don't think you have any particular or extra responsibility as the safeguarding governor to assess the risk of reopening as opposed to your other governor colleagues. And I'm going to take one more before we move on. Do you think it's acceptable for the chair to work with the head in discussing the assessment of risk and in making the decision to return, informing the rest of the governors later? Okay, well, I did touch on that slightly. What we are recommending and what we are advocating is a process that involves the whole governing board, but we accept that the circumstances and the situation in the lead up to any decision being made may make it very difficult to engage the governing board in a timely way or at an early stage. So ideally, it will be best if the chair acts as a sounding board, but that there is an opportunity for the whole governing board to have the discussion and to be assured that the risk assessment that's being carried out and the decision that's been made on the back of it is absolutely the right one and in the interests of pupils, staff, and everyone else. Those are all the questions I'm going to deal with for now. As I say, I'll make sure that we respond to every question that's been asked or every statement that's been made in some way. We're getting very near now to the end of this broadcast. So what I'd like to do really is just remind you before I finish, as I always do on the webinars that I deliver, that we're still working, even though our office is closed, to support you through this period. And hopefully you're finding our support to be beneficial. We're grateful for the feedback that you're giving us, but we will continue to do that and support you in the best way that we can for you to continue in this very important role during this time that we can't be together because of the social distancing and all that comes with that. So we will remain online and engaged, supporting you. So do stay in touch and do stay connected with us. So all that really leaves me to say is thank you very much for joining me today. Thank you for bearing with me on this webinar. I'll be entirely honest, I've lost complete track of time because of the technical issues that I've experienced earlier. If I've run over significantly, I do apologise, but I hope you found it worthwhile and useful. Do keep in touch. Thank you for all that you do and the remarkable job that you're doing in these very difficult circumstances when you have your own pressures as well. Stay healthy, look after those who are closest to you, enjoy the bank holiday weekend, the long bank holiday weekend, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon and hopefully with less technical difficulty. You take care. Bye-bye.